So here's where we are today in the City of Toronto. I'm going to treat two critical meetings in the City of Toronto as bookends that frame the climate crisis. The first critical meeting in this city was at the last week of June in 1988, and the next critical meeting that bookends that will be the third week of June in 2010. The last week of June in 1988, Canada hosted the first international scientific conference on the climate change issue. It was called Our Changing Atmosphere, Implications for Global Security. It was seen as a security threat. That conference brought together scientists from all around the world, over 400 of them, for the first time ever gathered in a public way. There had been scientific conferences and symposia. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter had been warned years earlier by the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. that the climate crisis from burning fossil fuels was a major threat. In Canada, the government of Brian Mulroney sponsored the conference in conjunction with the United Nations Environment Program and the World Meteorological Organization, and the Prime Minister opened the conference. There was no scientific controversy, by the way. There was none. Here you had the Prime Minister of Canada, progressive conservative, joining the Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, and making common cause that we had to address the threat of the climate crisis. The consensus statement of the scientists who gathered in this city 22 years ago began with the following sentence. And I don't think anything since has been clearer in describing the nature of the threat. They wrote, quote, "Humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to a global nuclear war." That's pretty clear. It's exactly what we've been doing, and every scientific report since 1988 has not only confirmed what they concluded in that conference here in Toronto, it's provided more detail, provided more background. What was then being viewed as we will see this as a change in future due to the buildup of greenhouse gases has changed to, yes, we see it now. We see the fingerprint of human activity on global climate systems. We know that we have created a global climate crisis, and now the debate is not about whether it's going to happen or how soon it's going to happen, but how quickly can we ratchet down greenhouse gases so that we can avoid the worst case scenarios of the climate crisis, those things that are sometimes referred to as going beyond the tipping points, going beyond the point of no return. Scientists describe it differently depending on what point of view they strike, but generally the global scientific consensus, which now, by the way, all of the G20 governments gathered last year in Italy agreed, including that, so G8 plus the 12, that we must ensure that greenhouse gases come down quickly enough that after things stabilize at a new level of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, after we get to a new equilibrium of greenhouse gases in the planet's atmosphere, that the total impact will be less than an increase of 2 degrees Celsius in global average temperature. Now, 2 degrees Celsius is a hard thing to be talking about because right away it both sounds like not much and it doesn't really make a lot. You say, well, 2 degrees, okay. Just to give you a frame of reference, the difference between the temperature on planet Earth today, in terms of global averages, and the temperature in the last ice age, when we were under a kilometer of ice. Right? So big differences, 10,000 years ago till now. But the difference in average global temperature is only 5 degrees Celsius. So 2 degrees is huge. A 2 degrees global average temperature increase is enormous. And what we're looking at is the risk that we'll shoot past 2 degrees, go to 3 degrees, and that's when we get away into something called runaway global warming, where 3 degrees becomes 4, and 4 becomes 5, and 5 becomes 6, because the processes that we will have unleashed through our activities in burning fossil fuels to warm the global atmosphere will themselves trigger other events which warm the atmosphere. So many of you are nodding, you know about this risk of runaway global warming, and we can avoid it. We're not there yet. We've got time, but we don't have a lot of time. We must ensure that greenhouse gases stop rising and start coming down by 2015. I'm not saying they have to come down to 50% of what they are now or 10%. Just saying this, the global scientific community is very clear that it is, since we're year on year adding to the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the atmosphere globally, in Canada, yes, and globally. Some countries have come down a lot. Sweden's come down a lot. The UK's come down. Germany, France. Most countries that signed and ratified, all the countries that signed and ratified the Kyoto Protocol have at least come down, and most have met their target. We're the only ones who decided not to pay any attention to our target. So 2015 is the year not that we come by any particular percent, but that we stop growing. We stop having a constant year-on-year increase in greenhouse gases. Freeze it there and see them come down. If we can do that, we've got the time to keep the transition going away from a dependency on fossil fuels with all the hell that brings on us, whether it's deploying the military to secure oil in unstable regimes around the world. So there's a certain definite link that many of you will know between the military-industrial complex and our dependency on fossil fuels. The other pain that we experience from burning fossil fuels, whether it's downtown Toronto smog or whether it's the growing oil slick in the Gulf of Mexico, there are a lot of good reasons, including the fact that we're running out of fossil fuels, to make a transition away and to do it smartly, to do it in a way that's both smart in the sense of let's do it quick step, please, quick step, and let's also do it so that we're smart, so that we're intelligent, so that it helps our economy. There are a lot of reasons to do this now, and every year of procrastination costs us jobs, costs us in losses to our environment, but also costs us because it becomes that much more expensive to get it right later. So where's this other bookend conference that I talk about in the city of Toronto? It's that we will be welcoming to Toronto the G20 in the third week of June. Now, ordinarily, when you've had an event like the Copenhagen Summit on Climate, which was last December and which failed, and the deadline had been set actually in Montreal. The only time Canada hosted a UN climate summit was in 2005 in Montreal, and at that meeting they set the deadline that we must have a negotiated conclusion to the successor agreement to Kyoto, and we must have it by 2009 at the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which would happen to be in Copenhagen. When you miss a deadline and your conference fails, that's the time to redouble efforts. It was an important deadline in three ways. The first is that for negotiating purposes, you need something to replace Kyoto when the first phase expires in 2012. In a lot of ways, that's the least interesting. That's a negotiated timeline. The UN came up with it. Okay, but that's the deadline. The other deadline is the deadline of science that I just reviewed. The atmosphere is not interested in negotiating with humanity. The atmosphere has no interest in our timelines, our politics, or our economic and political inertia. The atmosphere is loading with greenhouse gases from our activity, and that has consequences. We can't avoid those consequences. We can't argue them away. We can't negotiate them away. The third deadline is one that Gwynne Dyer added to my list when we spoke together in Toronto not long ago, and it comes from the thesis that he developed in his book, Climate Wars. And that is, we have to negotiate an agreement while we're still talking to each other. Because the impacts of the climate crisis, going back to the 1988 conference, are also about geopolitics and they're about security. And if and when we do nothing and we see sea levels rise and tens of millions of people, for instance, in low-lying areas of Bangladesh who become environmental refugees. We see areas that used to be food-producing, no longer producing food, so famine, human populations adrift, massive environmental refugees become an issue of geopolitical security, and people stop talking to each other quite so well as we still do now. So we have some tight timelines. The Copenhagen Summit did not succeed, but it was just one of many, because these conferences are annual. The next one is in Cancun, Mexico, in December 2010. And in the normal course of world events, we would be redoubling global diplomatic efforts to be ready to have something to negotiate in Cancun in 2010. And one of the great tragedies of this cycle of negotiations is that Canada is hosting the G20.